And hello and welcome to the Pumpkin Copter Cast, the good old podcast about video games. Today, relatively fresh from this year's Boston Festival of Indie Games, I have game dev Bill Gardner of the Deep End Games.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So, Bill, maybe you could tell my -7 viewers what exactly you do.
Sure. So I'm the creative director at the Deep End Games. It's a small company here in Boston, run mostly by me and my wife. I'm the designer, creative director type, do most of the implementation, and she is the writer and producer. And so we have a lot of contractors and people that we work with, that I've worked with in my past from my days at Irrational, along with a lot of new faces, some people fresh out of college, through like the Mass Digi program and things like that, but very young company, and we just released our first title, Perception, which was at BFIG, on PS4, Xbox One, PC, and we're about to hit the Switch very soon.
Cool. So I played a bit of it at the Indie Games Festival, but if someone were to walk up to you, like they heard you were making a game in passing and they wanted to know more about it, how would you elevator pitch it to them?
Sure. So Perception is a narrative thriller where you play as a blind woman. And so Cassie, she's been blind, and she uses echolocation to gather information, visual information from the world. So she can essentially see like a bat. So she sees through sound. And you're in this mansion in the middle of Gloucester, Massachusetts. It's a remote estate. And you're exploring it, looking for answers. As Cassie, you're a woman who's looking to prove herself, and you're doing that by essentially trying to get to the bottom of why this mansion, is haunting your nightmares. And so you show up looking for answers, and you wind up piecing together all of the history, the sort of sordid past of this one estate that's been there for hundreds of years, and you wind up jumping back in time as you answer questions and seeing the house change. And again, getting closer to that answer and closer to ultimately proving yourself.
Okay, so first I'm wondering, why is the protagonist, like when you were first coming up with the game, what made you decide to make the move to make the main protagonist, Cassie, blind in the game?
Sure. So there are a few different things there. I think that the first thing is, as we started to kick around ideas, I really wanted to have a different approach. I wanted to take on something that I'm not used to, coming from the BioShock series and working on games like BioShock and SWAT 4 and that sort of thing. I wanted to tell a story without, creating a shooter and without violence and without, basically also find a different way to show a different perspective, to represent the world differently and essentially, have a different aesthetic, have a different, like I said, perspective. And so we're kicking around ideas, and then the notion of playing a horror game. We don't say horror, but just use it as a shortcut. It's really a thriller. But playing as a spooky game where a bit of time researching blindness, but specifically echolocation and technology that is available, accessibility for blind people. We try to incorporate all of those learnings into, writing Cassie and creating the world that we have, and creating tools like we created this loosely based on a variety of different apps and accessibility tools. We have this thing called Delphi, which does text-to-speech for Cassie. So when you find a note, you're trying to piece together, again, the meaning of that particular chapter of the world, that time period. You can use text-to-speech to read notes, but then also sometimes you can connect with another character in the game, a sighted person, who will inform you of what you're looking at when you can't actually make up the details in the world, that kind of thing. So again, mostly driven from a a passion to try and take on something different and to bring in a little bit of a fresh take on narrative and visuals and all of that.
Okay, so why is like the mansion in which the game takes place like in Gloucester, Mass specifically? Is it because you grew up in that area, or you know someone who did?
That's definitely part of it. I think that there's also like you said you're a Swampscott, right? Is that right?
Yes.
I heard you forgot. Sorry. So yeah, there's something about the North Shore of Massachusetts. I did grow up here, as did my wife, and there's something in the air up here that's very kind of craggy, and there's something in the air. Like I said, if you look at a lot of classic horror, a lot of it stems from this area. Everyone from Stephen King to Lovecraft, and even Poe. A lot of traditional and classic horror, the best, come from this area. So there's that, but then there's also, I talked about, going back through the house's history, and there's a very clear reason why we chose this area, because there's some history in the game. And so without spoiling too much, there's a whole mess of reasons why Gloucester was the right choice.
Okay. So between, like, I know you said it's not, it's more closer to a thriller than straight up horror, but I guess it does have a bit of spook in it. So
sure, absolutely. Well, so the reason I avoid horror is because calling it horror, even though I love horror, is that I feel like it has a very stringent definition for a lot of people, and I feel like if it doesn't have gore, if it doesn't have the right sort of number, whatever that is, of jump scares and that sort of thing, it doesn't really hit for a lot of people. And so we're much more. I've always been more of a fan of like Kubrick and Hitchcock and early King, where it's much more about the tension and atmosphere and the slow burn of like building up that dread and that sort of thing. I really love that there's different types of horror, but for some reason in games there really isn't the same sort of diversity in horror. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I'd always sort of tried to find a way to present it more recently, even calling it a thriller. And when I tell people that, they're like, oh, okay, cool, I know what that means. And I don't really see that applied to games too much, but it really is perfect for what Perception is, I feel, because again, it's about that tension, and it's about that atmosphere and that dread. So it is horror, but I think it's more appropriate to call it thriller.
Okay. So when trying to make the atmosphere in the game appropriately, at times scary and tense, and having played the game myself, very remote from the rest of like the Gloucester area.
Sure.
Is there any like horror or a thriller franchise in video games or any other mediums that might have given you like some ideas to go off of when you started making this?
Well, the thing I always tell people is that Perception really is somewhere. If you were to take on one end of the spectrum, you have a Gone Home, a walking simulator, a very narrative-rich, world. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have something like Amnesia or Outlast. We're somewhere in the middle. I think you compare Amnesia to Outlast, and I feel like even in that case, there's a bit, quite a bit of a scale there. I think we're more on the end of Amnesia, where again, it's about that atmosphere and the tension. And I love that series. I love what they do at Frictional. But I would say again, the two clearest touchstones are Gone Home and Amnesia. But there's also elements of Alien Isolation. So we had a lot of touchstones. A lot of, like, I think narratively, I'm also a huge fan of the Fatal Frame games. And then more specifically, Silent Hill 2. That was a real touchstone for us. The way that it's just so laced with meaning. And there's a lot of symbolism, and to this day I'm still going back and analyzing it and trying to find additional meaning. That's important for us. Amanda, she was an English teacher for over 10 years, and so you talk about a lot of the inspirations, you talk about a lot of the references and that sort of thing. The game is rife with that sort of thing, and so it's always rewarding to watch and see people pull that out of the world. I feel like games tend to draw from the same pools of inspiration, Alien and Star Wars. And then there's usually the sort of flavor of the moment that games kind of pile onto. But we tried to look to different sources. All My Sons, and a lot of. I really can't talk about too many of them without tapping into potential spoiler areas. But again, when you play it and people pull out that information, it's cool. And that's the other thing too, is when you say horror, I think people tend to sort of shut their mind off a little bit and just sort of like just focus on the horror and don't, because you think about story in most horror games, with the exception of Silent Hill, they're all kind of there just to be functional. Mm-hmm. You're used to subpar acting and writing and all that sort of stuff. And, we wanted to try something a little different, so I think Thrillers, again, works a little better.
Okay. Before we move on to the next set of questions, I just, in response to you saying that your wife used to be an English teacher, as a teacher myself, I just want to say, more power to you.
Oh, okay. Well, what do you teach?
I am a preschool teacher, so pretty far removed from her educational range.
Wow. That's great. Good for you.
Yeah. Hopefully someday I'll be able to find a way to bring teaching and gaming closer together, but that's a bit of a far-off thing right now.
I can see that. Kids love the games, right?
Yeah. So... So were your kids, when your kids found out you were making like a scary game, were they interested in it at all? Did they like?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They're always asking about it and trying to catch a glimpse and that sort of thing. And we keep them away from it. It's not, again, there's really no goal or that sort of thing. But it's they're too young for it, and so we mostly keep them away. They know the basic premise, and they know that the character uses echolocation, and occasionally they'll get a glimpse of what that looks like, and they're fascinated. Not only by what they see, but also just sort of the process and what we do every day. And I try and include them in at least understanding what that process is. But they're gamers themselves, and they think it's fascinating.
So, one of the main hooks in perception is, using echolocation and making noise to, get a picture of your surroundings.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know literally nothing about how games do what they do. So, on a technical level, how did you do that? Like the echolocation, like you tap and it makes a noise in the area of the game you're in.
So that's a mix of different things. There's a layer of different effects and whatnot, but it's primarily a post-process effect mixed in with a light and then a variety of different tools to mask the light and give it a sort of randomized warble, if you will.
Uh-huh.
And it's based on a variety of different references and inspiration pieces. But yeah, so it's a mix of different techniques that you just sort of iterate on a bunch and try and capture. We're not a simulation. It's not really meant to be like, oh, this is exactly what the echolocation looks like. Because there are some, it's impossible to know exactly what that is, but there are a lot of references out there about, this is the way dolphins see, and this is the way bats see, and this is the way, all that sort of thing. But, in terms of echolocators, human echolocators, I've spoken with a few of them and spent a bunch of time researching, like I said, a whole semester studying and researching. And all we can do is sort of guess. And so you use cultural touchstones and references that you see in other, media, Daredevil movie and that sort of thing. Kind of extract. And then we also looked at a thing called slurring physics, which is a way to visualize things that we can't actually see. I can't see in ultraviolet. We can't see, sound, obviously, but we can't see heat and that sort of thing. And they have all these ways of visualizing what it looks like when a hair dryer is on, and so you can see the heat coming off and firing and that sort of thing. And so just experimenting with all these things and drawing all over the place to hone in on something that we think feels like what we what we heard and from echolocators, sort of what they were sort of experiencing, mixed in with, again, some of the cultural references and that sort of thing.
Okay, so moving on. Recently, when I was there at Boston Fig for shorthand, there is a pamphlet saying that in an upcoming update, or maybe it's actually updated by the time this goes out.
Hopefully.
Yeah,
it's been a little while to get this thing through. We've got some major updates, but yeah, it should be. Keep saying very soon, but it's in the works. I mean, it's in the system to get out there. We just need to get the right approvals at this point.
Yeah. So you seem to be like 3 different primary modes in the game, like one where it's just like strictly 100% only story. 2 where it's like it blends the story with like all the scary monsters and that death can set you back a bit, and then the 3rd mode, which is, hardcore mode, where, death can just permanently mess up a playthrough, or send you back all the way to the main menu. So, is that something, are those 3 modes of the game something you planned from the very start, or, like, in the
we had talked about these modes for a little while, and we had some feedback from things like PAX and that sort of thing. But we wanted to focus on something that we the sort of ability to tune. We're a tiny team, so in terms of the content, the level design, and the systems, that's almost entirely me, especially towards the end. And so I really wanted to make sure that we had the time to try and get something that was polished. And but we had the idea, and so it was a function of like, well, I wasn't really sure it would be appropriate, but then also just a function of time. And then a lot of the feedback we got was like, we had some people being like, oh, I really wish I could just experience the story of the game and just take in the atmosphere, and go around and sort of play it more like a walking sim. And then some people are like, oh, I really wish that the presence was more aggressive and that there, like I was less story, kind of thing. And so we were able to essentially add in both ends of that spectrum and, let people customize a bit about how they play.
So, without giving anything essential away, is the malevolent force that the protagonist has to confront throughout the game, is that based on any specific horror thing, or is it just like a blend of all sorts of stuff from movies and games that you've like played seen before?
The big bad that's in the game, we call it the presence, and a lot of inspirations there. But the initial concept, I basically went to Rob Waters, who was the concept artist behind the Little Sisters and all the Freedom Force characters and Songbird from BioShock Infinite. And I told him the feelings I was looking for and the concept, and he had concepted a few other things, and I told him, hey, I need a concept for the presence. And so he came back with this sort of burlap shrouded character, this shade, if you will, that is swarmed by moths and has sort of moth-like appendages, but you're not really clear as to what is beneath its cowl. So I always feel that when you sort of peel back the mask and see what's what the monster is. I mean, Stephen King, I believe, said it the best. It was like the second the big bad monster walks through the door and I see that it's 12 feet tall or whatever, I don't feel scared. I feel relieved, because in my head I was picturing a 17-foot tall monster, right? And so you're never gonna exceed what the player or the viewer has in their head. You're never gonna make it scarier than that. And so I feel it's important to leave that to mystery. And let's not kid ourselves. You get to the 3rd act of most horror, and you're disappointed because you see, like one of my favorite horror movies is Event Horizon, and the 3rd act is a mess, right? And partly because of narrative, but it's also because you start, without spoiling anything, you see Sam Neill all caught up and all that sort of thing. He's naked. It's just goof. So So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I just said there's a connection problem here, so we'll just plug through it. So, you just try to keep it over the player's head.
Okay. Yep, I think that covers like all the major info I wanted to get on perception. So if you don't mind, since we have a good bit of time left, before you and your wife started working on this, what's your background in working on games?
So I start at Irrational Games, and I started as QA, and then made my way to production design. And so it was a level design on a few unannounced projects or sort of prototypes that were kind of big. But then eventually made my way to level design on SWAT 4, and then eventually lead level designer on BioShock, and just a director on and then again there's a whole mess of other prototypes and things like that on the way. But eventually when Irrational did its thing or whatever, I went off and finished my grad school, and that's when I had the idea for Perception. So I started up at the Deep End Games, and just brought on my wife, who is my biggest collaborator. We worked together on when I was working on BioShock, I would come home every night and bounce around ideas with her, and she'd be writing. She's an English teacher, but she'd be writing a novel, one of her novels, and we'd sort of workshop each other's ideas. So when the chance came up to work together, I jumped on it.
Okay. So, when was the time in your life when you realized that video games are more than just a thing you did in your spare time? When did you realize, I want to invest a solid portion of my professional life into this?
Yeah. Well, honestly, the first time I decided I really wanted to was probably about... Actually, I have the letter right here. I don't know where it is, but back when I was about 9 years old, I think, 9 or 10 years old, I sent in pitches to Nintendo for Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and they told me that the game was already coincidentally being made by a different company, but I because they responded and they said, basically, you'll be pleased to know that the game you pitched, Indiana Jones, is being made by this other company. And I took that, being 10 years old, as they love my idea. They're going to make my game. And so, I spent years, studying games and that sort of thing, whatever I could. I mean, it was very different back then. There was no resources for this sort of thing. But it seemed like all development was done in Japan, and it was at the time. So I went to school for film, a little disappointed. I spent a little time in Hollywood, being kind of a script gopher, and then my senior year in college, you started to see Western development, particularly in the PC market, really take off. And so I decided I was going to come home and take up my old college job at Electronics Boutique, and that's where I met Ken Levine, and he offered me a position in QA at Irrational Games.
Neat.
Lucky.
So, when you do have, some recreational time to play games, what are your favorite games to, play by yourself, or with your kids, or with your wife and your kids, or just with you and your wife?
I love everything. I play pretty much every genre you can imagine. A lot of people say, I play everything but sports, or I play everything but I play everything. And so, right now, and I jump around a lot. Right now I'm jumping back and forth between, unfortunately, not as much time as I would like right now, just because we're finishing up on that. Well, we're into Nintendo right now. We have our Switch version waiting for approval, along with those patches I told you about, the updates. Mm-hmm. And so juggling all that stuff takes quite a bit of time. Obviously, a lot sort of perpetual crunch being here in my basement. But so I'm playing a lot of Switch now. I absolutely adore the Switch. I just got this, which I'm dying to play, because I'm the world's, well, I shouldn't say that, but I'm an enormous Metroid fan. You can't even see it.
Oh.
So I just got that. I haven't even opened it, as you can see. So I'm dying to play that. Although I might be going to China in a few weeks, so I'll probably save that for the plane. Um, so yeah, I try and play the latest and greatest, but I'm always going back. I'm really anxious or excited to play Divinity 2. What else? Just a lot of stuff on the burner,
Yeah, I know. So,
but overall, I'm a huge Nintendo fan, so I have pretty much all the systems. But the ones that are nearest and dearest to me are Nintendo titles, the big franchises.
Yes.
Obsessed with them.
I was quite the Nintendo kid growing up myself.
Nice.
So, So, if I may, when did your kids, like, as soon as they were able to, at that point in, if I may put on my teacher hat, at that point in their cognitive development, able to play games, did they take to games right away, or was it just like a slow burn kind of thing?
No, they took the games right away. I think it's a very different time with. They really. So we had the controllers in their hands pretty young. I don't even know. It was probably around 2 when they started to kind of mess around with the controllers. But there was a period. I don't know if it happens so much anymore, but when the iPad was first out, and that was really big. You'd see little 16, 18-month-olds like using the interface and that sort of thing. But yeah, from a very early age, my second son was almost a savant with his biggest game was Mario 3D World on the Wii U, which is a spectacular game and did not get the attention it deserved. Everyone's super hot on Nintendo right now, but they don't realize that really they've slowly been having a new renaissance. I think Breath of the Wild is the sort of amalgam, like the sort of pinnacle of that. But you go back to the Wii U, and there are some absolutely spectacular titles on there. Some of their best in over a decade, I feel. And Mario 3D World is no exception. And so he was obsessed with it for a while. Basically, I think he was probably 3 or 4, and he was finishing it. And he was really it's great because you can play up to 4 players. Mm-hmm. As a family, we'd all play it together, and that was a lot of fun because it's competitive co-op. You're all going for the stars and that sort of thing, but you're on the same level.
Oh yeah, I remember.
So yeah, from a very early age.
Oh, that's neat. I know a lot about like competitive co-op. Way back in the day with New Super Mario Bros. Way. That was the subject of quite a lot of tension in my house. Mainly just because we always enjoyed just trying to mess each other up, throwing each other off cliffs at literally every opportunity.
Good fun.
So, good family and friendship destroying fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, let's see. So, yeah, that seems like a good stopping point, but before we sign off, would you like to plug Perception one last time and all the places it is and will be available?
Yeah, no, as I said, we're a tiny team, so I take any chance I can get to plug it. I thank you for that. So yeah, Perception. It's on Xbox One, PS4, PC, and very soon, hopefully in the next few weeks, on the Switch. So labor of love, very very much a narrative-driven game. If you like, spooky games like Amnesia, but then also things with a little bit more of a narrative thrust. Games like Gone Home. You should be right at home with this. We drew inspiration from all over the map. Again, my BioShock days, the way the story is presented there, the sort of atmosphere and the world building and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun to work on, and obviously it's our first title as a company, so we're really excited to get it out there. So help us spread the word.
All right, so there you go, Perception, and that brings us to the end of this particular episode of the Pumpkin Copter Cast, a good old podcast about video games. If there's actually anyone watching this, like, rate, comment, subscribe. It really helps me out, blah, 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 blah. If for some reason you want to, you can follow me on the Twitters at tgorman83, which is also where I post a lot of the updates. And is there any social medias of yours you want to plug?
Sure. So my personal one is Game On Gardner, and the company one, the Deep End Games, is at the Deep End Games. And then we also have a website, of course, www.thedeependgames.com, which we really should update more, but I'm a terrible person.
Yeah, that's it. This has been T. Gorman83 with the Deep End Games person, Bill Gardner, and we will see you next time.
Awesome. Thank you.